Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Ches Amud Aleph 8a of Megillah, and we're starting from the Mishnah at the very top of the page. The Mishnah says, Ein bein hamudar hana mechavero lemudar mimenu machal. There is no difference between one who avows himself from benefiting from his friend in general. So he takes a neder, he takes a vow that he won't derive any benefit from his friend, from another person. There's no difference between that and one who doesn't make a general vow not to benefit from anything, but specifically says, I'm not going to benefit food from you, sustenance from his friend. There's no difference between those. They would disqualify him from any benefit, except the only differences are, Ella, drisas haregel. So, drisas haregel literally means like the stomping of the feet, the walking of the feet, that he'd be allowed, if he avowed himself from food, he'd still be allowed to walk in his friend's property, but if he avowed himself from any benefit, then he would not. V'kelim shein osim bohen ochel nefesh. And the other difference would be using his friend's things that are not involved in the preparation of food, that you don't use to make food. The kalim, the vessels, the utensils that are used, or appliances that are used to make food, he would not be able to use, because that's benefiting. That's a benefit toward the preparation of food, which he's not allowed to benefit anything relating to food. But things that are not involved in the preparation of food, he'd be allowed to use. Again, if he only avowed himself from his friends, from benefiting from his friend in a food-related way. But if he took a general vow, so then he could not benefit at all from any of his friend's utensils, whether they have to do with the preparation of food or not. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, we can derive from here, we can infer that with regards to the vessels that you do use for ochel nefesh, utensils, appliances that are used to prepare food, each of these cases will be equal, whether he avowed himself from any benefit from his friend, or whether he avowed himself from benefit that's food-related. Either way, he would not be able to borrow his friend's toaster oven or fork or whatever it might be, anything that's involved in the preparation of food. Now, and then the Mishnah said, drisas haregel. One difference would be walking in his friend's property. So the Gemara asks, but why is there a problem? Even if he avows himself from benefit in general, why is there a problem to benefit halo kapti inshi? People are not makbid. People don't care. So, and Rashi just adds, and therefore why is it usher if you are mudar hana, if a person avows himself from benefiting from his friend, but it seems the Gemara's thinking is that only prevents me from benefiting from my friend if it's like something that he's giving up, but something that he doesn't care about at all, would seem, in the question at least, is not a problem, because this is something, people walking on his property, he doesn't care. People don't care if people cut across their lawn. That's at least assumed in the question. So, or use a shortcut across their property. So something that he doesn't care about, and he just allows everyone to do. So, at least in the question, we're saying that's not really a benefit that I'm getting. Why would that be a problem? Even if I avowed myself from benefit from him in general, but something that he allows everybody to do, he's not makbid, but he doesn't care about, I should be allowed to still do that. So the Gemara answers, Hamani, who is this going like? Rebbe Eliezer. It's going in the opinion of Rebbe Eliezer, de Amar Vitur Aser. That even something that somebody doesn't care about is still aser to benefit b'mudar hana when you take a vow not to benefit. So the havamina and the question, we thought that when I take a vow not to benefit from you, it only includes things that it only includes things that, in the question we thought, it only includes things that the friend cares about, that he feels like he's giving something up, but something that he doesn't care about wouldn't be considered a benefit for me. The answer is that no, we're going like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that any benefit's forbidden. Once you take a vow not to benefit from your friend, so even vitor, even something that he doesn't care about, even something that he lets everybody do, so you might say it's not a benefit because everybody gets it, but still, even that is considered forbidden, and that's why the Mishnah says that Jerisas Haregel, that walking on his property would be a practical difference between someone who takes a vow not to benefit at all from his friend, he would not be allowed to cut across the property, as opposed to someone who just vows not to get any food-related benefits, then he would be allowed to cut across the property. Okay, next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ein bein nidarim l'nidavos. There's no difference between nidarim and nidavos. Now, we're still talking about neder, but a different kind of neder now. Now we're talking about a neder to bring a carbon. So somebody takes a vow to bring a carbon, and a nidava is also a type of vow to bring a carbon, a donation of a carbon, and these two types of vows to bring a carbon are the exact same. The only difference is elasha nedarim chayev b'achriyusan, unidavos eino chayev b'achriyusan. The difference is that if somebody takes a neder to bring a carbon, to bring an offering, and then something happens to the animal before he has a chance to bring it, so it dies, or it runs away, or it gets lost, whatever it might be, so and he can't bring it, so he has to bring another animal to replace it. He's chayev b'achriyusan, he's responsible to replace it. That's if it was a neder. But if it was a nedava, so then he is not responsible to replace it. If it was a nedava and then something happened to it before he had a chance to bring it, he doesn't have to replace it, he can just walk away, even though he vowed to bring a carbon. But in the case of a nedava, he wouldn't have to replace it. And we'll see in a moment why. So, in the Gemara, we'll understand what the difference between a neder and a nedava is and why this plays out this way. Now, now, one thing we can infer, though, if that's the only difference, is whether you have to replace it if the animal gets lost or dies. So that would imply that with regards to Baal Ta'acher, they're equal. What's Baal Ta'acher? Baal Ta'acher is the prohibition to delay in bringing a carbon that a person promised to bring. So this was a topic in Masechtas Rosh Hashanah that usually discussion is actually how it works, of how many regalim, but let's say 3 regalim within 3 regalim, 3 holidays, people would go to the Beis Hamikdash, each of the regalim, they should bring their carbon, and if they don't, then they transgress Baal Ta'acher, and it doesn't matter if it was a neder or a nedava, it doesn't matter which way the person vowed to bring the carbon, whether as a neder or a nedava, either way, if they don't, after 3 regalim, they would transgress Baal Ta'acher. Okay, now what is the difference between a neder and a nedava? That's the Gemara now will address. Ezohi neder. Ezahu neder. What is a neder? A neder is Hare Olai Ola. It's a person says, I take upon myself to bring a carbon Ola. An elevation offering, a burnt offering. So it's a voluntary offering, and the way the person expressed it is he said, Hare Olai, it's on me to bring it. Now because, okay, fine, that's a neder. Ezohi nedava, and what's a nedava? A nedava also is a person takes upon themselves to bring a carbon, but they say it differently. It's ha'omer hare zu ola. It's they point to an animal and they say that should be a carbon ola. That should be an offering of an ola. They didn't say Hare Olai, it's on me to bring an ola. They said that animal is an ola. That's a nedava. Now, Uma bein nedarim l'nedavos. So what's the difference practically? The Mishnah asks, and it was also expressed by our Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, actually in Kenan, I think. So what's the difference? What's the difference between nedarim and nedavos? Nidarim, by Nidarim, if you take a neder, you say, Harei Olai, it's on me to bring a carbon. So Mesu o Nignevu Avdu, if it dies or gets stolen, or is lost, Chayev Achar Yusar, you're Chayev to replace it. Nidavos, but Nidavos, if you say this animal is a carbon, so Mesu o Nignevu Avdu, if it dies or is stolen or is lost, Eino Chayev Achar Yusar, you don't have to replace it. You're not Chayev to replace it. And although the Gemara is about to ask what's the source for this, but it logically makes sense too. If a person said, Harei Olayo, it's on me to bring an Ola, and then he chose an animal, well, if something happens to that animal, well, he said it's on me to bring an Ola, so pick a different animal. That's why when it comes to a neder, where a person says Harei Olai, it's on me to bring an Ola, so if something happens to it, he has to replace it. However, if it was a nedava, so he said, this animal is an ola. Well, if that animal dies, it died. So it's not, there's no other animal that needs to be ola. He didn't say, I'm going to bring an ola. He said, this animal is. So if something happened to that animal, then he doesn't have to replace it, because he never said, it's upon me to bring an ola, just said that animal. So that's why a neder, you have to replace it, because you took it upon yourself, harei alai ola. And in the dava, you don't have to replace because you said that animal is going to be an ola. Now the Gemara asks, Mina hanimili, what is the source, at least for the idea that you have to replace it by a neder? So the Tana Rabban and the rabbis taught. The pasuk says, in this process of bringing this voluntary offering, it says, V'nirtza lo l'chaper alav. V'nirtza lo, it will bring ritza, it will bring acceptance from Hashem. L'chaper alav, to atone on him, it says, to atone on him. So Reb Shimon says about this pasuk, Es she'alav chayev b'achri. So you learn from here that which is on him, that which is alav, it's like l'chaper alav, to atone on him. You learn from here that which is on him, he has to replace. He's responsible to replace. Ve'es she'eino alav, eino chayev b'achri yusah. But that which is not on him, he does not have to replace. So what's the drasha exactly? So Rashi explains for us that the pasuk says v'nirtza lo, so it should be nirtza, should be accepted. It should bring ritza. It should bring acceptance from Hashem, and but lichaper, to atone, implying that it will only atone once it's once there's likishi skaper ben havya nirtza. Once the atonement is done, then it's wanted. But before that, it's not wanted. It's not. He's not accepted. So he's not done yet, basically, until he completes the atonement by bringing the carbon. So he's not accepted. He's not done. So, and what is that about? It's about the one that's alav. The nirtza lo lechaper alav. So the one that it's only nirtza, it's only accepted, it's only a done deal. Once it's mechaper, once it atones, is the one that's alav. And what's does alav refer to? Alav refers to a neder, and that's the next line of the Gemara. Going back to the Gemara says, "My mashma." My mashma. Why is it implied that? Actually, Rashi says, why is it implied that alav is an acceptance of achrayus, of responsibility? Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rav Dimi says, "Kima da'amar alai." Because when the person says harei alai ola, he says it's upon me. Kimandatoying akasve dami. It's as if he's carrying it on his shoulders. It's on him. So he's taking responsibility for it. So the one that he says Allah, he says it's on me. That's the one that it's only nirtza, it's only done. It's only accepted once he actually completes the kapara. That's now the other one kind of doesn't talk about the nedava. I don't think a person would have an acceptance of a carbon that they never bring, but maybe it's partial. Once he dedicated the nedava, this animal, and then something happened to it, maybe there's a partial ritzoy, a partial acceptance, even though he never had a chance to bring it. That's, I guess, a little bit implied, if I'm reading this right. As opposed to the neder, the pasuk is saying that it'll only atone once it's actually brought. Okay. Next Mishnah. Okay, now the next Mishnah discusses the concept of a zav. So a zav is discussed at the end of Parshas Mitzorah. There's a zav and there's a zava. A zav is a male and a zava is a female. They're a little bit different, both in the halachos and what they're talking about. So a zav is a man who has certain types of emissions. They're not seminal emissions, but they're some kind of pus-like emission that will make him tameh, and we'll see the details of that in a moment. It's not something that we nowadays know how to identify, and we don't keep the laws of Tuma and Tara are not really practiced now anyways. It's not as relevant at the moment, but that's a parsha in the end of Parshas Mitzorah. So the Mishnah says, Ein bein zav haroesh shtei riyos l'roesh shalosh ela karbon. There's no difference. Once a zav sees 2 emissions, or he sees 3 emissions, it won't make a difference except with regards to a carbon. But meaning in terms of his making things tameh, already at 2 he makes things tameh. Once he's had 2 emissions, so there's no difference between 2 and 3. The only difference is that after 3 he has to bring a carbon as part of his purification process. Rashi tells us that this 2 or 3 would be either 2 in one day, or 2 over the course of 2 days in a row, or 3 in one day, or 3 in 3 days in a row, or even 3 over the course of 2 days. So there's no difference between 2 and 3 except for the obligation to bring a carbon. Says the Gemara, Ha'ing in Mishkav u'Moshav, u'Svira Shiva, Zev Zesham. But in terms of 2 other relevant halachos of zav, which are mishkav and moshav, that's one. That is, zav makes things tameh through mishkav, through lying on them, or moshav, sitting on them. I believe it has to be something that it's normal to lie on or sit on. It's meant for that, but he would make that bed or couch or whatever it would be, he would render it tameh, or I guess sheets, or he would render them tameh. And also, when a zav, as part of his purification process, after he's become tameh, he has to have 7 clean days, shiva nikiyim, before he can go to the mikvah and purify himself. Now, with regards to those 2 things, it sounds like they're equal, both if a zav saw twice, 2 emissions, or 3 emissions. 1 emission is nothing. It's not until he has 2 emissions, or 3. That's what it seems from here, at least. Okay, now, Minahani Mili. What is the source for this, that they're equal in terms of Tumah, but not in terms of Carbon? What's the source that after 2, a person is already Tameh, but they will only have to bring a Carbon as part of their purification process if they've had 3 emissions? So the Tamar Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Rabbi Simai Omer. Rabbi Simai says, Mana akasav shtayim v'karotame. The pasuk mentioned ziva, the flow. Zav literally means like a flow, that he had emissions 2 times, and it called him tameh. And then elsewhere, in another pasuk, shalosh, it mentioned it 3 times, v'karotame, and called him tameh. So these are the psukim in the context of zav, and so first one pasuk says Rashi quotes them, V'ish ki zav mi besaro zovo tamehu. If a person has flowing from his flesh his emissions, he's tameh. But it says zav and zovo, it says it twice, and then he's tameh. That it takes 2 zivos, 2 flows, 2 emissions to become tameh. And then another pasuk there says, Bizos tia tumaso bizovo. This will be his tuma, his impurity, bizovo, when he has a flow. Rar b'saro es zovo, o hachtim b'saro mizovo. So there again it mentions zovo this time 3 times, and says that's how he becomes tameh. So which one is it? Does it take 2 to become tameh, or does it take 3? So the Gemara says, ha-ketzad. So how does it work? Shtayim l'tama. After 2 times he's tameh, and he'll make things tameh if he sits or lies on them. V'shalosh l'karban. But it takes 3 times before he's obligated to bring a carbon, which is, in the later psukim there, he has to bring a carbon as part of his purification. That's only if he saw 3 times. So we have a contradiction. One pasuk implies that it takes 2 to become tameh. One pasuk implies that it takes 3. So the Rabbi Simai's answer is that it takes 2 to become tameh, but it takes 3 to become obligated in a carbon. Ask the Gemara, maybe it should be the opposite. Ve'emar shtayim l'tama v'lo l'carbon. Maybe it takes, or not the opposite, but maybe it takes 2 that you become obligated that you become tameh. And maybe 3, shalosh, l'carbon, below 2. Maybe after 3, you have to bring a carbon, but you're no longer tameh. So it's an interesting suggestion, which the Gemara rejects, right? But it's suggesting maybe after 2, you're tameh, and after 3, it's a different story. You're not tameh anymore, you just have to bring a carbon. So the Gemara says that can't be. Amar ta'ad shelo ra shalosh ra shtayim. Because by the time you've seen 3, you've seen 2, so you're tameh. How did you become not tameh? That wouldn't make sense. So, fine. So, ve'emer shtayim l'karbon v'lo l'tama. But maybe it should be like this. At 2 times, you bring a carbon, but you're not yet tameh. Shalosh af l'tama. And after 3 times, you become tameh also. But maybe not. Maybe 2 times, you're not yet tameh. Maybe 2 times, you just have to bring a carbon. And maybe it takes 3 times to become tameh. That's another possible way to resolve this. So the Gemara says, "Lo sagadaitach." Now don't think that. The Tanya, because we have the following brisa. The brisa says, it says, "V'chiper alav hakohen lifnei Hashem mizovo." So it's talking about the karbanos that the zav brings. And it says the Kohen atones for him mizovo, from his zavness, from his being a zav. So but mizovo implies from the possible types of zav. Meaning miktzas zavin mevi'in karban, or miktzas zavin ein mevi'in karban, which teaches me that from amongst the types of zavs, there are those who bring a carbon for kapara, for atonement, and there are those who don't. Okay, so now how could that be? That some zavs bring a carbon, some zavs don't. If it was that after 2 times you have to bring a carbon, then every zav brings a carbon. Because you're not a zav until you saw at least 2 times. And, right, if we said that after 2 times bring a carbon, after 3 times you're tameh, well, every zav saw 2 times at least. Even to get to 3 times, but at 2 times they're bringing a carbon already. So it must be the opposite. If only some zavs bring a carbon, if it's mizovo from amongst the types of zavs that get kapara, that need kapara from a carbon, so it has to be like this. It has to be haketzad ra shalosh maybe, that once you see 3 times you bring a carbon. Shtayim eino maybe, but if you see 2 times, you don't yet have to bring a carbon, right? Oeno ala ra beis maybe ra shalosh eino maybe. Maybe you'll say the opposite. Maybe you'll say if you see twice, you bring a carbon, but if you see 3 times, you no longer have to bring a carbon. So that can't be Amar ad shelo ra shalosh ra shtayim. Because once you saw 3 times, that means you saw twice. You already were obligated in a carbon. So it must be, if we're saying that that mizovo teaches me that from amongst the different types of zavs, some nigatomen from a carbon, it must be that two re'iyos, two sightings do not yet require a carbon, just makes him tameh, and that's the type of zav that doesn't bring a carbon. And then, but once there's three re'iyos, once a person has three emissions, sees three emissions, then they're obligating a carbon, and that's the one who atones with the carbon. Okay. Says the Gemara, V'itztrich de Rebbe Simai, V'itztrich mizovo. Now we have kind of two sources to split this up and say that that if you have two, you don't bring a carbon, and if you have three, you do bring a carbon. The first was Rebbe Simai. Rebbe Simai said that we have a contradiction. We have one pasuk that says two emissions, two re'iyos, two zavs, you're tameh, and one says three. Which one is it? He said, two is to become tameh, and three is to bring a carbon. That was one source for this difference, that two is tameh and three brings a carbon. The second source is this other pasuk that says that the Kohen atones mizovo, which implies that only some zavs bring a carbon and some don't. Well, how could that be? It must be that after two re'iyos, you are tameh but don't bring a carbon, because there are some zavs that don't. So it must be that's the zav who only saw two times. But if you see three times, then you bring a carbon. So it seems to be two sources for the same thing. So the Gemara says, no, but we need both of them. De'i mid Rebbe Simai. If all I had was the first one, Rebbe Simai, like it says two in one pasuk and three in the other pasuk, I might have said kikushyan, like our question from earlier. Our question was that maybe, it's fine, it's 2 and 3, but maybe 2 brings a carbon, and at 3 you become tameh. So, and what's wrong with that? So, Kamash Malon, mizovo, it's only because the second pasuk, the second source that says mizovo, that says no, there are some people who don't bring a carbon, some zavs, so it must be that that's the 2. V'i mizovo, now if I only had mizovo, that said, this pasuk that says that some zavs bring a carbon, some don't. But lo yodana kamarios, I wouldn't know how many sightings, how many emissions it takes. That I only know from the other pasuk, from Rebbe Simai, that there's a pasuk that says zav twice, and another pasuk that says zav 3 times. That's how I know that it's 2 to become tameh and 3 to bring a carbon. So kamash malan to Rebbe Simai. That's what Rebbe Simai comes to teach me, how many times it takes to become tameh, and how many times it takes to become obligated in a carbon. Okay, says the Gemara, V'hashta de amar to mizovo lidrasha. Now that you're telling me that the words mizovo get to be darshan, they get to be, we get to learn something out from them. So, because that's what we did. We said, because the pasuk says mizovo, it says v'chiper al hakoyin lifnei Hashem mizovo, from his zavness, and that implied that there's some zavs who don't need a carbon. So now we have another pasuk that also has the word mizovo. What about this pasuk? V'chitar hazav mizovo, when the zav becomes tahor from his being a zav, my darashtabe, what are you going to learn from it? Right? In a sense, this word is extra, and that's, I guess, why we're learning out from it both times. Why else is he becoming tahor from? That we're talking about a zav. So it says that when the zav becomes tahor from being a zav, well, that's obvious. So it's an extra word. So it's to be darshan. It's to learn something from. So what are we going to learn from it in this pasuk? So says the Gemara, we need it for the following idea from this brisa. It says v'chiyitar hazav. When the zav becomes tahor, and this pasuk is saying that he counts 7 clean days when he becomes tahor. So just the pasuk that we're talking about, it says v'chiyitar hazav mizovo. When the zav becomes tahor from his being a zav, from his flow, from his emissions, v'safar lo shivas yamim l'taraso. Then he counts 7 days, like we said, 7 clean days. He has to have 7 days where he has no emissions. V'chibes begadav, and then he washes his clothes. And he goes rachatz b'sara b'mayim chayim v'tayr. He goes to the mikvah. So what is that mizovo teaching me? So what it's teaching me is that he can count to 7 clean days as soon as his ziva stops, as soon as his emissions stop. Okay, that's somewhat obvious, but what does it teach me? But mizovo from his being a zav, velo mizovo unigao. But he wouldn't have to wait for both his ziva to go away and his nega. What kind of nega? We're talking about tsaras. So let's say a person is not only a zav, he's also a mitzora. He also has tsaras, leprosy. So talking with tsaras also has a purification process. He actually goes to the mikvah twice to become pure. So does the zav have to wait? Does he have to wait till he purifies himself from being from tsaras before he can count his shiva nikiyim? Because you might have said, at least if it didn't say mizovo, it says v'chitar hazav. When he becomes tahor, then he can count. So maybe if he's both a zav and a mitzora, he has to become pure from being a zav and a mitzora before he can count. But that's why it says mizovo. No, he only has to wait till he's pure of being a zav, of having emissions, then he can count his shiva nikim. He doesn't have to wait until he becomes pure of his tsaras. That's what mizovo teaches me. Okay. Now, it says mizovo v'safar. Right? He's pure from his being a zav, v'safar, and he counts his 7 days. Says the Gemara, we made al zav baal shtei re'ios sheta'un sfiras shiva. What it teaches me is that a zav, already after he sees twice, he needs to count 7 clean days, which, right, we mentioned before, but now we're going to learn it out, that really it's our Mishnah, right? Whether a zav saw 2 times, 2 emissions, or 3 times, there's no difference. The only difference is with regards to a karban, the Mishnah said. But our Gemara inferred, with regards to counting shiva nikiyim, 7 clean days, both have to do it before they can become pure. So the Gemara is now telling us, how do we know that even after 2 sightings, a zav has to count shiva nikiyim before he can become pure? He needs 7 clean days. So it's learned from here because it says mizovo, and he counts. And mizovo teaches me that even if he only saw 2 emissions, he still has to count. In other words, in this case, we're taking the word mizovo and saying from a partial zav. Right? A full zav would be if he saw 3 times. Then he is a full zav, he even has to bring a carbon. But even if he's a partial zav, he only saw 2 times. He only had 2 emissions. So still, mizovo is safar. Even if it's only a partial zav, the kind that just makes things tummy but doesn't need a carbon, the one who only saw two times, still he has to count shiva nikim. He needs 7 clean days before he could become pure. Ask the Gemara, why do we need a pasuk for that? Valodinu. Can't we logically deduce it? In metame mishkav moshav, if we know that after 2 times he makes things tame, so lo yetam sfira shiva, isn't it obvious that he certainly should need, if he can make things tame, then all the more so he should need shiva nikim, he should need 7 days to become pure. And what if it's, I don't know if it's such a kal v'chomer, but the point is that we see that if he makes things tame, he's a zav. If he's a zav, he's tame, he should need the shiva nikim. Why would you say not? Okay, carbon, we have a special way to learn out that he doesn't have to bring a carbon. But why wouldn't he need shiva nikim? Wouldn't anybody who makes something tame need 7 days to shiva nikim to purify themselves? So, or any type of zav, at least. So the Gemara says, top of the next page, shomeres yom keneged yom tochiach. No, that assumption can be refuted by the case of the shomeres yom keneged yom. What's this talking about? So now we're going to shift from a male zav to a female zava. A zava is a little bit different. A zava is a woman who became a nida, and then and then she became pure, or she had her 7 days of nidus passed, and so after those 7 days, there's now an 11-day period where if she would see dam, if she would emit any blood during that time, so then she any nida blood, so then she would, by Torah law, she wouldn't be a nida, she would be a zava at that time. Now her laws, the zava's laws are different than a zav, and a zava, if she sees one time, so she has to, she's kind of on guard to see if she'll see again. She becomes Tamea for 1 day, and she's on guard to see if she'll see again, and if she sees 2 times, also she's on guard. If she's 3 times, then she needs Shiva Nikiyim. So, but when she sees 1 time, she becomes a Zava for that day, and she makes things Tameh, but she doesn't yet need Shiva Nikiyim. She doesn't need 7 clean days. Only if she sees 3 times does she need 7 clean days. So, so we see from a Zava that just because somebody can make things Tameh, or even within the context of Zava and Zava, even though a Zava can make things Tameh, but she doesn't need Shiva Nikiyim unless she had 3 days in a row of a flow. So our assumption that we said, well, if the Zav makes things Tameh, wouldn't he certainly need Shiva Nikiyim, 7 clean days? Why do we need a pasuk? That's refuted. It's not a good assumption because we see from Zava that that's not always the case. So Shemeres Yom Pinagim Tochiach, a woman who's guarding day by day, meaning she became a Zava because she had a flow during that 11-day period, a flow of blood, and she is now waiting to see if she would see again. But for today, she's Tameh, she's Tameya, and she's Shemetamas Mishkav Moshav. She would make things Tameh if she sits or lies or sits on them. Ve'inatunas v'ya Shiva, and she doesn't need Shiva Nikiyim. Ve'af ata alta Tameh alzeh. And the Gemara continues and says, and don't wonder about this. Sha'afal pi shemetame Mishkav Moshav, that even though this Zav makes things Tameh, Mishkav Moshe, by lying on them or sitting on them, Lo Yetan Svira Shiva. So you might say, based on that, just like the Shomeres Yom, the Zava doesn't need Shiva Nikiyim at the beginning for 1 day, so too a Zav who saw twice only. He's only a partial Zav. He didn't even see 3 times. So you might think that he doesn't need Shiva Nikiyim. Talmud Lomar, and that's why we have this pasuk, Mizovo V'Safar. That it says, if he's Mizovo, if he became pure from his Zavness, V'Safar, he has to count. What's that? What's this Mizovo teaching me? Miktsas Zovo V'Safar. Even if he's only a partial Zav, he still has to count. Limed Zav Baal Shtei Riyos Sheton Svira Shiva. Which teaches me that even if he only saw twice, he still needs to count Shiva Nikiyim because of this word Mizovo, which teaches me that even though he didn't become a full Zav, he only saw 2 out of 3. He only saw twice, but that's enough. Twice we know already is enough to make things Tameh. And from this pasuk we learn that B'Safar he also has to count Shiva Nikiyim. So Amar Rav Papa Abaye, Rav Papa said to Abaye, Maishna hai mizovo demarbi be zav Baal Shtei Riyos. What's the difference that here, the second mizovo that we just learned out from, we say that it comes to include a zav who saw 2 times. Umaishna hai mizovo, why is that different than the other mizovo previously? Dimemait be zav Baal Shtei Riyos, which excluded a zav that saw twice. In other words, the things don't seem to add up. Rav Papa's asking Abaye. See, earlier we had a drasha. Earlier, the first mizovo was the pasuk that said, "V'chiper alav hakol lifnei Hashem mizovo." It was talking about bringing a carbon, and it said, that he should atone before Hashem mizovo. And we said mizovo is extra. What's it coming to teach me? That it's only from amongst the types of zav. That's who has to bring a carbon. Some zavs have to bring carbon, some don't. Which ones do? The ones who saw 3 times. Which ones don't? The ones who only saw 2 times. So their mizovo actually excluded a zav who only saw 2 times. And so he doesn't have to bring a carbon. But now, the second mizovo, we're saying, is coming to say, it says mizovo v'safar, from being a zav, and he has to count. That teaches me that even a partial zav, even a zav who only saw 2 times, has to count. So here mizovo is coming to include a zav who only saw 2 times. Before mizovo was coming to exclude a zav who saw 2 times. How does that make sense? Says the Gemara, Amar Le, so Abaye said, because over here, there's no other way to explain it. Isal kadaita chai lim'ute hudasa. If you would think that this pasuk that's talking about counting is coming to exclude a zav who only saw 2 times, lishto kramine, it should have just left out the word mizovo completely. Because why would I assume that if he only saw 2 times, he has to count? Why would I assume that? There's no source for that. There's a source that he's tameh, he makes things tameh, but there's no source that he would have to count. Now you'll say, what do you mean? You can learn it logically. If he makes things tameh, then he should also have to count Shiva Nikiyim. We already rejected that though. Shemeres Yom, K'neged Yom, Tochiach. Right? That the female Zava who makes things tameh, if she only saw once, she was a Zava one day, she can make things tameh, but she doesn't yet need Shiva Nikiyim until it's 3 days in a row. So we wanted to figure out logically that a Zav who saw twice needs Shiva Nikiyim. V'chitema, now you might have a different suggestion. It's not extra. Haimi bayile mizovo v'lo. We had another drasha from mizovo before. We kind of doubled up on this mizovo. We said that mizovo teaches me that the zav can count as Shiva Nikiyim once he's purified from being a zav, and he doesn't have to wait until he's also purified from being a mitzorah, from his tzaras, to start counting his 7 clean days. And then we said, and also mizovo v'safar, that it also teaches me that a zav who only saw twice, who was only a partial zav, also counts Shiva Nikiyim. So we're doubling up on it. So it's not extra. So we say, no, im kein lichtov kra v'chi yitar hazav v'lishtog. No, because then the Torah could have said, when the zav becomes tahar, and it could have stopped right there. And I would have also understood that he just has to become tahar from being a zav, and he doesn't have to become tahar from his taras in order to count. So mizovo is completely extra. Mizovo is completely extra. So mizovo lamali. So why does he have to say it? And again, the main point for us is if it was true that a zav who only saw 2 times is excluded from counting, then don't say the word mizovo at all. And we would have no reason to assume that he's included in counting. So mizovo lamali. So why does it say the word mizovo? So it must be that it meant to flip things. It must be that it says mizovo for this point, that it's telling you that mizovo b'safar, that even somebody who's only a mizovo, he's a partial, he's miktzah zav, he's a partial zav, he only saw 2 times, b'safar he has to count. And so that's how we derive that even though before mizovo excluded somebody who saw 2 times from bringing a carbon, here mizovo comes to include somebody who saw 2 times, that he also has to count Shiva Nikiyim. And so that's how we kind of get back to our Mishnah, that the only difference between a zav who saw 2 times and a zav who saw 3 times is whether he has to bring a carbon. He only has to bring a carbon after 3 times, but in terms of making things tameh, and in terms of needing 7 clean days to purify himself before he can go in the mikvah, they're equal whether he saw 2 times, whether he saw 3 times. He'll need those Shiva Nikiyim, those 7 clean days.